April 19, 1945, near Heidelberg, Germany. 11:47 a.m. The air smelled of wet ash and scorched stone. Along the muddy shoulder of what had once been Reichsstraße 37, a column of women trudged westward under armed escort. Their uniforms, field grey wool jackets, bearing the Wehrmachtshelferin insignia, were stained dark with rain and dust. Boots squelched through mud that clung like memory. Above them, the sky hung low and colourless, a sheet of April cloud that swallowed sound. The women did not speak. They moved in silence, eyes fixed on the boots ahead, shoulders hunched beneath the weight of what they had become, prisoners at the column's edge. A young woman, no older than 22, stumbled. Her name was Marguerite Schilling, though in that moment, names meant little. She caught herself on the shoulder of the woman beside her, steadied, and continued. Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from hunger, a hollow, grinding hunger that had become her constant companion over the last 11 days. She had eaten twice in that span, a fistful of raw oats stolen from a shelled barn, and a heel of mouldy bread shared among 7 women in a roadside ditch. Her stomach had folded in on itself. She no longer dreamed of food. Dreams required energy she did not possess. Ahead, the American convoy had halted. Olive-drab trucks lined the road, their engines idling in low growls. Soldiers in clean fatigues moved among them with the efficiency of men who had done this many times before. Marguerite watched them through the fog of exhaustion. They looked enormous, dash-well, dash-fed, broad-shouldered, their faces clean-shaven and untroubled. They did not shout. They did not strike. They simply gestured, directing the column toward a field hospital tent erected on the hillside above the road. White canvas rippled in the wind, marked with red crosses that seemed impossibly bright against the grey world. Inside the tent, warmth. Marguerite felt it before she saw anything else, a rolling wave of heat from portable stoves that drove the numbness from her cheeks. The scent followed, stewed beef, potatoes, onions. It struck her like a physical blow. Her knees weakened. She stopped just inside the entrance, blinking, unable to reconcile what her senses reported. Around her, other women froze similarly, mouths open, eyes wide. Some began to weep, immediately spied involuntary sounds that rose from chests that had held too much for too long. American nurses moved among them. They wore olive-drab uniforms with white aprons, their sleeves rolled to the elbows, hair pinned back with practical efficiency. One approached Marguerite, a woman in her 30s with tired eyes and steady hands. She carried a tin bowl filled with stew, steam curling from its surface. She extended it without ceremony, without pity, without judgment. Just an offering. Marguerite stared at the bowl. Her hands would not move. The nurse placed it gently into Marguerite's unresponsive palms, wrapped the cold fingers around the warm metal, and said something in English. The words meant nothing, but the tone meant everything. Kindness, simple, uncomplicated kindness extended to an enemy. Marguerite looked down at the stew. Chunks of meat floated in thick gravy, real meat, not the sawdust and awful ersatz they had been issued for the last 3 years. Potatoes cut in generous pieces, carrots. Her vision blurred. The bowl shook in her hands, and then she wept deep shuddering sobs that bent her forward until the nurse steadied her with one hand on her shoulder. Around the tent, dozens of women were crying now, spoons halfway to mouths, unable to eat for the grief and relief and shame flooding through them all at once. This was not what they had expected. This was not what they had been told. To understand the magnitude of that moment, the collapse, the tears, the disorientation, one must first understand what these women had been taught to expect. The machinery of propaganda is not built overnight. It is constructed piece by piece, story by story, image by image, until the architecture of belief becomes invisible, as natural as breathing. The women who wore the grey uniforms of the Wehrmachtshelferin had grown up inside that architecture. They had been shaped by it. The female auxiliaries of the German armed forces were not soldiers in the strictest sense. They did not carry rifles into combat, did not storm bunkers or man artillery pieces, but they were soldiers nonetheless. They served as radio operators, administrative clerks, anti-aircraft spotters, telephone switchboard operators. They worked in military hospitals, supply depots, communication centers. By 1945, over 500,000 women had served in various auxiliary capacities for the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine. They wore uniforms. They took oaths. They lived under military discipline, and they absorbed, with unquestioning devotion, the narratives fed to them about the world beyond Germany's borders. Chief among these narratives was the image of the enemy. The Soviet soldier, they were told, was a subhuman barbarian, a Bolshevik brute who raped and murdered without conscience. The British were decadent imperialists clinging to faded glory. And the Americans were mongrels, a nation of racial degenerates and capitalist gangsters, weak, soft, corrupted by luxury and jazz, and the chaos of democracy. Their soldiers, the propaganda insisted, lacked discipline. They could not endure hardship. They fought not for ideology or honor, but for profit, for plunder. They were cowards who relied on machines because they lacked the will to fight man-to-man. Goebbels' Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda had refined this message to razor sharpness. Newsreels showed American cities in flames during race riots. Leaflets depicted G.I.s as criminals and rapists. Radio broadcasts mocked American materialism, portraying a nation drowning in its own excess, incapable of sacrifice. The message was clear. The Americans might have more tanks, more planes, more ships, but they had no soul. They had no purpose. They would collapse the moment Germany struck back with true Willenskraft, force of will. The women believed it. Why wouldn't they? It was all they had ever known. Marguerite Schilling had been 17 when the war began. She had spent her teenage years in the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls, learning that service to the Volk was the highest calling. She had volunteered for auxiliary duty in 1943, proud to contribute, certain of victory. She had operated a radio switchboard in a command bunker outside Mannheim, relaying messages through nights of bombing, sustained by coffee and duty and the unshakable belief that Germany was fighting for its survival against inferior enemies. But belief, no matter how fervently held, cannot survive indefinitely against contradictory evidence. By the spring of 1945, the contradictions had become impossible to ignore. The Americans were supposed to be cowards. Yet they had stormed ashore at Normandy under withering fire and fought their way across France. They were supposed to be logistically incompetent. Yet their supply lines stretched unbroken from the Atlantic coast to the Rhine. They were supposed to be weak. Yet they had shattered the Wehrmacht's last offensive in the Ardennes and now stood on German soil, advancing with mechanical inevitability. Still, propaganda adjusts. When reality refuses to conform, the narrative shifts. Yes, the Americans were advancing, but only because they had overwhelming material superiority. They were cowards hiding behind their machines. Yes, they were winning, but they would show their true nature once they occupied Germany. They would plunder. They would brutalize. They would prove themselves the barbarians that German propaganda had always claimed. This was what the women expected as they were marched into captivity. This was the lens through which they interpreted every interaction. When American soldiers appeared on the roads, rifles slung casually over shoulders, laughing among themselves, the women tensed, braced for violence. When they were herded toward the field hospital, they expected interrogation, humiliation, perhaps worse. The fear was not abstracted, was visceral, immediate, pounding in their chests with every step. And then they were given stew. The tent at Heidelberg was not unique. It was one of hundreds established by the U.S. Army Medical Corps as American forces swept across Germany in the spring of 1945. The scale of the brief humanitarian operation was staggering. By war's end, American forces would process over 11 million displaced persons, prisoners of war, and refugees. The logistics of feeding, housing, and providing medical care for this population required an infrastructure that dwarfed anything the world had seen. The American military understood from the beginning that this was not merely a practical necessity, was a strategic imperative. The treatment of prisoners and civilians would speak louder than any propaganda broadcast. It would either confirm or refute everything the enemy had been told. General Dwight D. Eisenhower issued explicit orders regarding the humane treatment of prisoners. The Geneva Conventions were to be scrupulously observed. Prisoners were to receive adequate food, shelter, and medical care. Abuse would not be tolerated. This policy was not born of naive idealism. It was calculated. American military planners had studied the collapse of Germany in World War I, when starvation and brutality in the final months of the conflict had fed resentment and mythology, poisoning the peace. They had seen how the Nazis had exploited those narratives to rebuild German militarism. They understood that winning the war required not just defeating the enemy's armies, but dismantling the ideology that sustained them. And ideology, they knew, was vulnerable to empirical contradiction. The nurses who staffed the field hospitals were, in many ways, the vanguard of this psychological campaign. They were not trained as propagandists, they were medical professionals, many of them volunteers who had enlisted to serve. But they understood instinctively what the women in grey uniforms needed. Lieutenant Sarah Coleman, who served with the 128th Evacuation Hospital in Bavaria, later wrote in her journal, "They looked at us like we were going to shoot them. Some were shaking so hard they couldn't hold the bowls. We just kept ladling the stew. Eventually, they ate. And then they cried. I don't think I've ever felt more useful." The meals themselves were a revelation. American military rations in 1945 were the product of industrial abundance that Germany could no longer imagine. The U.S. Army issued an average of 4,000 calories per day to its frontline soldiers. Even re-echelon troops and prisoners received more food than most German civilians had seen in years. The stew served in the Heidelberg Tenter, standard field kitchen preparation contained real beef from American cattle ranches, potatoes from Idaho, carrots from California. It was prepared in quantities so vast that waste was inevitable to the German women, accustomed to rationing ersatz ingredients. And months of near starvation, it seemed like something from a dream. Marguerite Schilling ate slowly, mechanically. The first bite was difficult, her throat constricted, rebelling against the richness. The second was easier. By the third, she was eating with both hands, scooping stew directly from the bowl, gravy running down her wrists. She did not care. Around her, women did the same, hunched over bowls, wolfing down food with animal urgency. Some vomited immediately, their stomachs could not handle the sudden abundance. The nurses moved among them with buckets and damp cloths, cleaning without comment. Bringing fresh bowls, smaller portions, bread to settle their stomachs. It took an hour before the initial frenzy subsided. The women sat on the ground, bowls empty, faces blank with exhaustion and confusion. They had been fed. They had been fed by the enemy. The Americans, the supposed barbarians, the mongrel cowards, had given them more food in one meal than they had eaten in a week. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. Everything they believed had been constructed on a foundation of certainty. We are right, they are wrong. We are strong, they are weak. We sacrifice, they indulge. But sitting there, bellies full for the first time in months, the foundation cracked, the tears came in waves. Some women wept silently, faces turned away, shoulders shaking. Others sobbed openly, unable to contain the flood of emotion. A few sat motionless, eyes dry, staring at nothing, overwhelmed into numbness. The nurses moved among them, offering blankets, water, quiet reassurance in a language most did not understand. Words were irrelevant. The gestures spoke clearly enough. You are safe. You are cared for. You are not forgotten. Lieutenant Coleman crouched beside a young woman who had collapsed against a tent pole. Racked with sobs, the woman's hands clutched the empty bowl as if it might be taken from her. Coleman gently pried the bowl free, set it aside, and draped a wool blanket over the woman's shoulders. The woman looked up red-eyed, face swollen and said something in German, rapid and choked. Coleman did not speak German, but she recognized the tone. Apology, gratitude, shame. She placed a hand on the woman's shoulder and held it there until the sobbing quieted. What breaks a person is not always violence. Sometimes it is kindness. Violence can be understood, categorized, resisted. It confirms what you already believe about the enemy. But kindness and expected, undeserved kindness, shatters the architecture of belief. It forces recalibration. If the enemy feeds you when you expected brutality, what else have you been wrong about? If the Americans are not barbarians, what does that make you? What does that make the cause you served? These questions had no easy answers. For the women in the tent, the meal was not just sustenance, it was evidence. Evidence that the world was not as they had been told. Evidence that their leaders had lied. Evidence that the sacrifices they had made, the years they had devoted, the beliefs they had held, all of it, had been built on deception. The grief was not just for their hunger, not just for their suffering. It was for the loss of certainty, the collapse of meaning. They had been so sure, and now they were sure of nothing. Psychologists, who later studied the reintegration of German prisoners and auxiliaries, identified this moment of cognitive rupture as critical. Dr. Hans Becker, a German psychiatrist who worked with the Allied occupation forces, wrote in 1947, "The prisoners who adapted most successfully to post-war life were those who experienced a clear, undeniable contradiction between propaganda and reality. Those who were brutalized confirmed their prejudices and remained bitter. Those who were treated humanely were forced to question everything. The latter process was painful, but it was the only path to genuine transformation." The meal at Heidelberg, and thousands of others like it, served as that undeniable contradiction. It was a small thing in the vast machinery of war: a bowl of stew, a blanket, a kind word. But small things, accumulated, shift mountains. The women who ate that day did not immediately abandon their beliefs. Ideology is not so fragile, but a seed of doubt had been planted. And doubt, once rooted, grows. Food, in wartime, is never just food. It is power. It is politics. It is symbol. The American abundance that filled the field hospital tents was not accidental. It was the product of a nation that had industrialized agriculture, perfected logistics, and remained geographically untouched by the destruction ravaging Europe. While German factories were bombed into rubble, American factories ran 3 shifts, producing everything from aircraft carriers to canned beef. While German farms lost men and horses to the front, American farms mechanized, feeding not only their own population, but supplying millions of tons of food to Allied forces worldwide. This disparity was not lost on the prisoners. Marguerite Schilling, sitting in the tent with stew cooling in her stomach, tried to make sense of it. She had been told that America was weak, that its people were soft, that its economy was on the verge of collapse. But the evidence suggested otherwise. The trucks outside were new, well-made. The soldiers' uniforms were clean, properly fitted. The food was plentiful, varied, fresh. Everything spoke of a nation operating at full capacity, unburdened by the desperation that had consumed Germany. Over the following days, as the women were processed and moved to a larger POW camp near Frankfurt, the evidence accumulated. The camp itself was a revelation: rows of tents erected with geometric precision. Latrines dug according to sanitation regulations, a medical station staffed by doctors and nurses. The food came regularly, 3 meals a day, every day. Oatmeal with milk and sugar for breakfast. Soup and bread for lunch. Stew or hash with vegetables for dinner. Coffee, real coffee, not the acorn and chicory substitute they had choked down for years. The abundance was almost offensive. One woman, a former Luftwaffe radio operator named Ilse Hartmann, later recalled, "I was angry at first, angry that they had so much, while we had so little. It felt like mockery, like they were rubbing our noses in their wealth. But then I realized this was normal for them. They weren't flaunting it. This was just how they lived. And that was more terrifying than any weapon. How do you fight a nation that can feed millions while fighting a war on 3 continents?" The question haunted many of the prisoners. Germany had mobilized every resource, stripped every farm, conscripted every man, and still lost. America had fought across the Pacific and Europe simultaneously, maintained a civilian economy that produced consumer goods throughout the war, and ended the conflict richer than it began. The disparity was not merely material, it was philosophical. It suggested that the German model, the ideology of sacrifice and total war and racial purity, was fundamentally inferior to the American model of industrial capitalism and liberal democracy. This realization did not come easily or uniformly. Some women rejected it entirely, clinging to the belief that Germany had been betrayed from within, that victory had been stolen by traitors and cowards. Others accepted it with bitter resignation, too exhausted to care. But many, like Marguerite, began the slow, painful process of reevaluating everything they had been taught. The symbolic power of the meal extended beyond the immediate moment. In the weeks and months that followed, as Germany collapsed and the full horror of the Nazi regime became undeniable, the memory of that first bowl of stew took on additional meaning. When the women learned about the concentration camps, first through rumors, then through forced tours of liberated camps, then through the undeniable photographic evidence, the contrast became unbearable. They had been starving, and the Americans had fed them. What had Germany done? What had been done in their name, with their silent complicity? The stew became a symbol not just of American abundance, but of moral clarity. The nation they had been taught to despise had extended basic human decency to its enemies. The nation they had served had built factories of death. Lieutenant Coleman encountered this transformation firsthand during a conversation with a former auxiliary named Greta Vogel. It was July 1945. 3 months after the surrender, Vogel spoke some English, learned in school before the war. She approached Coleman during an evening meal distribution, hesitant, struggling for words. Vogel asked, "Why you give us food?" "We were enemy." Coleman considered the question. She could have given the official answer: Geneva Conventions, military policy, strategic considerations. Instead, she said simply, "Because you were hungry." Vogel's eyes filled with tears. She nodded, unable to speak, and walked away. Coleman wrote in her journal that night, she wanted a complex answer. Philosophy, politics, something to match the complexity of what she's feeling. But the truth is simple. They were hungry. We had food. What else would we do? I think that simplicity is what breaks them. They expected cruelty or calculation. They got basic humanity. And it's rewriting everything they thought they knew. The rewriting was not instantaneous. For many women, it took years. Some never completed the process, dying bitter and unreconciled. But for those who did undertake the transformation, the meal remained a touchstone, a moment when the world revealed itself to be different than they had imagined, a moment when the possibility of change became real. By September 1945, most of the female auxiliaries had been released from Allied custody and sent home or to whatever passed for home in the shattered landscape of occupied Germany. Marguerite Schilling returned to Mannheim to find her childhood home reduced to rubble. Her father dead in the war's final weeks. Her mother living in the basement of a bombed-out apartment building. The city was unrecognizable. Whole neighborhoods erased. Streets impassable. The air thick with dust and the smell of decay. She found work with the American occupation forces as a translator. Her English was functional, learned in school, and improved through necessity. She worked in the office that processed ration cards, helping German civilians navigate the bureaucracy of survival. The Americans controlled the food supply now, distributing it through a network of depots and relief stations. The rations were meager by American standards, but generous compared to what most Germans had eaten during the final years of the war. Every day, Marguerite watched people line up for food. Old men, widows, children with hollow eyes. They shuffled forward, clutching their ration cards, eyes downcast, shoulders bowed with exhaustion and humiliation. The Americans behind the counters were efficient, impersonal, fair. They did not gloat. They did not punish. They simply distributed the allotted amounts and moved to the next person. One afternoon, a woman collapsed in line. She was perhaps 50, though malnutrition and hardship made age difficult to judge. She fell to her knees, then forward onto her face, unconscious, before she hit the ground. The line froze. An American medic appeared within seconds, crouching beside the woman, checking her pulse, calling for a stretcher. She was carried to a medical tent, revived, given water, and a small meal. When she was stable, she was allowed to return for her ration. Marguerite watched the entire sequence. It was routine. The Americans had seen hundreds of cases of malnutrition and collapse. But to Marguerite, it was a revelation. Here, in the ruins of Germany, in the midst of defeat and occupation, the enemy still extended care, still treated German civilians as human beings worthy of preservation. The ideology that had sent millions to their deaths in pursuit of racial hierarchy and Lebensraum had collapsed. But the simple ethic of feeding the hungry remained. She thought of the tent near Heidelberg, the stew, the nurse's hands steadying her own, the taste of real meat, the unbearable kindness. She understood now that it had not been a trick or a calculated gesture. It had been an expression of a fundamentally different worldview, one in which the value of a human life was not contingent on race, nationality, or ideology. One in which feeding the hungry was simply what decent people did. The transformation was not universal. Germany in the late 1940s was a landscape of competing narratives. Some former Nazis retreated into denial, insisting they had known nothing, done nothing, been victims themselves. Others embraced a new victimhood, portraying Germans as the primary sufferers of the war, glossing over the crimes committed in their name. The Cold War provided a convenient opportunity for rehabilitation. Both the Americans and Soviets needed German allies and were willing to overlook uncomfortable histories. But there were also those who undertook genuine reckoning. They were a minority, perhaps, but a significant one. They were the people who looked at the evidence, faced the contradictions, and chose the harder path of transformation. Marguerite Schilling was among them. In 1947, she attended a public lecture in Heidelberg organized by the American Cultural Affairs Office. The speaker was an American historian discussing the Marshall Plan and the reconstruction of Europe. He spoke of the plan not as charity but as enlightened, self-interest stable. Prosperous Europe was in America's interest, so America would invest in its former enemy's recovery. The logic was cold, but the effect was warm. Billions of dollars would flow into Germany to rebuild infrastructure, industry, civil society. After the lecture, Marguerite approached the speaker. She asked, in careful English, "Why help us? After what we did?" The historian, a man in his 50s, wearing horn-rimmed glasses and a tweed jacket, considered the question. "Because," he said, "the alternative is to leave you in ruins, starving and resentful, and in 20 years we fight another war. We tried that after the first war. It didn't work. So, we're trying something different. We're betting that prosperity and democracy make better neighbors than poverty and bitterness." It was a pragmatic answer, almost cynical in its calculation. But Marguerite heard something else in it, the possibility of redemption. Not forgiveness. What had been done could not be forgiven, not fully, but the possibility of becoming something different, of building a future that was not merely the echo of a terrible past. She carried that possibility with her. Through the long years of reconstruction, she watched Germany split into East and West, watched the Cold War harden into permanent division, watched her country become a battlefield for competing ideologies. But she also watched schools reopen, factories rebuild, cities rise from rubble. She watched democracy take root in the West, fragile but real, and she remembered the meal, the symbolic power of that meal, replicated thousands of times across Germany in the spring and summer of 1945, cannot be overstated. It was a small gesture, easily overlooked in the grand sweep of history, but it was precisely the kind of small gesture that changes how people see the world. The women who wept in the field hospital tents did not weep only from hunger or relief. They wept because the world had revealed itself to be different than they believed, larger, stranger, more complex, and in some ways more merciful. The stew became, in memory, a symbol of American abundance, but it symbolized something deeper as well. The idea that abundance could be shared. That wealth was not a zero-sum game, requiring the destruction of others, that prosperity and generosity could coexist. This was the ideological battlefield on which the Cold War would be fought, not just capitalism versus communism, but visions of human nature itself. Could people be trusted with freedom? Could prosperity be built without coercion? Could former enemies live side by side without descending into perpetual violence? The meal suggested that the answer might be yes. It was not a guarantee. History is full of generosity betrayed, of good intentions perverted, but it was a data point, a piece of evidence that a different way was possible. And for the women who experienced it, that possibility was transformative. Decades later, historians and oral history projects would collect testimonies from German civilians and soldiers about their experiences in the immediate aftermath of the war. A recurring theme emerged: the shock of American behavior. They had expected brutality. They received care. They had expected plunder. They received reconstruction. The dissonance forced recalibration. Not for everyone's, some narratives are too rigid to bend, but for enough people to matter. Marguerite Schilling gave her own testimony in 1985, recorded as part of a university project on wartime experiences. She was 62 by then, a grandmother, living in a comfortable apartment in She spoke clearly, without drama, recounting the facts. The column of prisoners, the field hospital, the stew, the tears. Then she paused and said, "I think that was the moment I stopped being a Nazi. Not consciously, I didn't decide it. But something broke. I had been so certain, you understand, certain that we were right and they were wrong, certain that our suffering was noble and their comfort was weakness. And then they gave us food, and I realized that certainty itself was the problem. The ideology demanded certainty, demanded that we never question, never doubt. But doubt is how you find truth. And the truth was, in that bowl. We were starving. They fed us. Everything else was built on that simple fact." The American nurses who served in the field hospitals of 1945 were not philosophers or ideologues. They were practical women doing a difficult job under harsh conditions. Most of them never fully understood the impact of their actions. They ladled stew, distributed blankets, cleaned wounds, and moved on to the next crisis. To them, it was simply what nurses did. The universality of care, the idea that suffering demanded response regardless of politics or nationality. This was foundational to their profession. But in acting on that principle, they became agents of transformation. They did not preach democracy or lecture on ideology. They simply demonstrated an alternative way of being. And that demonstration was more persuasive than any propaganda. Lieutenant Coleman returned to the United States in December 1945. She resumed her civilian career as a surgical nurse in Philadelphia, married in 1948, raised 3 children, and retired in 1975. She rarely spoke about the war. Her children knew she had served overseas but learned few details. It was only after her death in 1992, when they discovered her journal in a trunk in the attic, that they understood what she had witnessed and done. One entry, dated April 22, 1945, stood out. "Gave out stew again today. Hundreds of them, mostly women, all starving. They cry when we feed them. Every single one cries. I used to think tears were a sign of weakness. Now I think they're a sign of something breaking open. The hard shell they built around themselves to survive it cracks, and what comes out is just human. Scared, hungry, confused, but human. Maybe that's the whole point of what we're doing. Not to punish them, not to prove we're better. Just to remind them and us that underneath everything, we're all just people trying to survive. If we can remember that, maybe we can avoid doing this again." The hope expressed in that journal entry was not naive. Coleman had seen enough of the war to know that human cruelty was real, persistent, and inventive. But she had also seen that human decency was real, persistent, and consequential. The balance between the two determined the shape of history. In the decades following the war, Germany underwent a transformation unprecedented in modern history. The Federal Republic, established in 1949, became a stable democracy, an economic powerhouse, and a committed member of the Western Alliance. The process was neither smooth nor inevitable. There were setbacks, scandals, unresolved questions about complicity and guilt. But the overall trajectory was clear: from totalitarianism to democracy, from aggression to cooperation, from pariah to partner. Many factors contributed to this transformation. The Marshall Plan provided economic foundation, Allied occupation ensured initial stability. The Cold War created incentives for Western integration. But beneath these structural factors was a psychological shift. A change in how Germans understood themselves and their place in the world. And that shift began with small moments of cognitive dissonance moments. When reality contradicted propaganda. When the enemy behaved unexpectedly. When certainty crumbled. The meal was one such moment. It was not unique. American soldiers shared cigarettes. Medics treated wounded prisoners. Military governments enforced law rather than chaos. Each instance chipped away at the edifice of ideology. But the meal had particular resonance because food is so fundamentally human. Everyone understands hunger. Everyone recognizes the act of feeding as an expression of care. In that universality, the meal transcended politics and touched something deeper. Marguerite Schilling lived until 2003, in her final years. She volunteered at a refugee center in Sudan, helping to process asylum seekers from the Balkans, the Middle East, Africa. She taught German to new arrivals, helped them navigate bureaucracy, listened to their stories. When asked why she devoted her time to this work, she said, "Because someone gave me stew when I needed it. I'm paying it forward." It was a simple answer, but it contained multitudes. The memory of that meal had shaped the rest of her life. It had taught her that transformation was possible, that enemies could become neighbors, that the architecture of hate could be dismantled piece by piece. She had been on the receiving end of grace unearned, unexpected, transformative. Now she extended it to others. This, perhaps, is the ultimate meaning of that moment in the field hospital tent. It demonstrated that the cycle of violence and retribution was not inevitable. That a different response was possible. That feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, caring for the suffering, these were not signs of weakness, but expressions of a strength more durable than any military might. The Americans who ladled stew in April 1945 were not trying to make a philosophical point. They were simply doing their jobs. But in doing those jobs with competence and humanity, they planted seeds of a different future. The stew itself was unremarkable standard field kitchen fare. Prepared in bulk, served in tin bowls. But context transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary. For the women who received it, that meal was a door opening, a glimpse of a world organized by different principles. It was evidence that the narratives they had been fed for a decade were false, that the enemy was not monstrous, that the ideology they had served was built on lies. The tears they shed were tears of grief and relief intertwined. Grief for what they had lost, not just the war, but the certainty that had given their lives meaning. Relief that the catastrophe they had feared, brutal occupation, starvation, chaos, had not materialized. And beneath both emotions, a tentative, fragile hope that perhaps the future was not as dark as they had imagined. This hope was not universal. Many Germans emerged from the war too traumatized, too bitter, too invested in old narratives, to embrace transformation. The wounds ran deep, and healing took generations. But for those who could accept it, the meal offered a starting point, a place to begin again. In the grand sweep of history, a bowl of stew is a footnote. But history is made of footnotes, small human moments that accumulate into larger patterns. The Treaty of Versailles shaped the interwar period, but so did a million individual acts of kindness or cruelty. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe, but so did the daily choices of nurses, soldiers, administrators who treated former enemies as future neighbors. The women who wept in the field hospital tent were participants in one of history's great transformations. They did not choose their role, it was thrust upon them by defeat and circumstance. But they chose how to respond. Some retreated into bitterness. Others, like Marguerite, chose transformation. That choice, multiplied across millions of individuals, reshaped a nation and, ultimately, the world. April 19, 1945. A tent near Heidelberg, a bowl of stew, tears falling into gravy. It seems too small a thing to carry so much weight. but the most profound truths often hide in simple gestures. The American nurses who served that meal did not think they were changing the world. They were feeding people who were hungry. And yet, in that act, they demonstrated a truth more powerful than any propaganda, that abundance shared is stronger than scarcity hoarded. That generosity builds what cruelty destroys, that the simplest human decency can crack the foundations of the most elaborate hate. The women who wept understood this, even if they could not articulate it in that moment. Their tears were not just for themselves. They were for the future that had been lost, and the future that might yet be possible. They were for the dead and the living, for the lies they had believed and the truths they were beginning to glimpse. They were the sound of something ending and something else, tentative and fragile, beginning to grow. In the decades that followed, as Germany rebuilt and Europe healed, that moment in the tent would be replicated in countless forms. Former enemies would become allies. Occupation would give way to partnership. The ruins would yield to reconstruction. And always, beneath the grand strategies and political calculations, there would be small human gestures: a meal shared, a hand extended, a moment of grace between strangers. These are the moments that redeem us, not because they erase what came before, but because they prove that something else is possible. That we are not condemned to repeat the same cycles of violence forever. That transformation, though difficult and incomplete, is real. The stew has long since been consumed. The tent has been dismantled. The women who wept have lived their lives and passed into memory. But the truth they encountered remains, as relevant now as it was then. That in our deepest hunger, what we need most is not victory or vindication, but the simple recognition of our shared humanity. And that when we receive that recognition, especially from those we least expect, it changes us in ways we cannot predict or control. This is the lesson written in tears and stew, in field hospital tents and ruined cities. This is the truth that no ideology can suppress, no propaganda can say, that we are, all of us, human first. And when we remember that, when we act on it, despite our fears and hatreds, we open the possibility of a different world. The women who wept have left us that possibility. What we do with it is our choice.